I didn't know that reading Goodnight Moon to a stranger's child on a freezing train platform would be the reason a dangerous man said my name like he'd been carrying it for years. The station clock above track 9 blinked 11:47 p.m. in weak red numbers, and the whole place smelled like wet concrete, burnt coffee, and that tired kind of silence cities get after midnight. My shift at the public library had ended 2 hours earlier, but the last train downtown was delayed again, so I sat on a cold metal bench with my thrift store coat pulled tight around me and a paperback balanced on my knee. That was when I heard the crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just this small, breaking sound, the kind a child makes when he's trying very hard to be brave and failing anyway. I looked up and saw him sitting 3 benches down, tiny sneakers not even touching the ground, both hands wrapped around a worn stuffed rabbit with one ear bent sideways. He couldn't have been older than 5, maybe 6. Dark hair, pale skin, big green eyes full of tears. He kept blinking back like he didn't want anybody to see them. No parent nearby, no frantic voice calling his name. Just that little boy in a station too big and too cold for someone his size. I moved slowly, the way you do around skittish animals and scared kids. "Hey," I said softly, stopping a few feet away. "You okay?" He didn't answer. He only looked at me, then at the tracks, then at the rabbit in his lap. His lower lip trembled. I noticed his coat first. Navy wool, beautifully tailored, probably cost more than my monthly rent. Then the tiny leather shoes. Then the silver bracelet around his wrist with a name engraved on it, though I couldn't read it from where I stood. Nothing about him belonged in this station alone. "You don't have to talk," I told him. "I'm Charlotte." Still nothing. So I sat down on the opposite bench, close enough that he knew I wasn't leaving, far enough that he didn't have to be afraid. The station speakers crackled overhead with another apology about delays, and somewhere behind us, a janitor rolled a mop bucket across the tile. The boy flinched at the sound. Instinctively, I reached into my bag and pulled out the children's book I'd checked for repairs before leaving work. It was old, the cover bent at the corners, but the pages were still soft from 100 careful hands. "My mom used to read to me when I got scared," I said, opening it under the yellow platform light. Maybe this helps. Maybe not. But I'm pretty good at voices. That got the smallest change in his face. Not quite a smile. Just less fear. So I started reading. Quietly. Steadily. Like the story mattered. Like the night could still be gentle. And little by little, his shoulders loosened. His breathing slowed. By the 3rd page, he had moved closer without seeming to realize it, until he was sitting beside me with his rabbit tucked under one arm and his head leaning against my sleeve. I was halfway through the last page when I noticed them. Men in dark coats at the far end of the platform, scanning faces, speaking into earpieces, moving with the kind of focus that made the air feel suddenly sharper. Something in my chest tightened. The boy felt it too. His small fingers grabbed the edge of my coat. Then the station went strangely still. Not silent. Worse. Controlled. I looked up, and a tall man in a black overcoat stepped out of the shadows near the stairwell, like the whole station had been waiting for him to arrive. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Power moved differently. His eyes found the child first, then lifted to me. And before I could stand, before I could explain, before I could even breathe right, he said, in a voice low and calm enough to undo me completely, "Charlotte Hayes." For one suspended second, I forgot how to breathe. My name did not sound like a question in his mouth. It sounded like recognition, like certainty. The man standing 10 feet away was easily 6'3", broad-shouldered beneath a black cashmere coat that probably cost more than my car, with dark hair brushed back from a face too composed to be kind and too tired to be cruel. He looked younger than Power usually looks, maybe mid-30s, but there was something old in his eyes. Not age. Wait. The kind that settles into a person after years of carrying too much and trusting too little. Around him, the men I had noticed earlier shifted without making much noise, forming a loose half circle that did not feel accidental. The little boy beside me went still, then whispered one word so softly I almost missed it. "Papa." The man's expression changed at that. Not by much. A slight release around the mouth. A breath that looked expensive men in tailored coats were not supposed to need. He stepped closer, and the station lights caught the sharp line of his jaw, the silver watch at his wrist, the rein still clinging to the shoulders of his coat. "Ethan," he said, and the boy slid off the bench so quickly my sleeve went cold where his head had been resting. He ran straight into the man's arms. Not dramatic, not desperate, just immediate, like this was the one place in the world that still made sense. The man lifted him with practiced ease, one hand at his back, the other smoothing down his hair. He closed his eyes for half a second against Ethan's temple, and that tiny, private gesture hit me harder than all the dark suits and silent authority put together. Then his gaze came back to me. Sharp again. Controlled again. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low, polished, unmistakably American, though there was a faint trace of something older in the shape of certain words, like family history had left fingerprints on his vowels. I stood because sitting suddenly felt too vulnerable. "You know my name," I said, and I hated how small my voice sounded in that giant, echoing station. One of the men behind him moved, maybe reacting to my tone, but the man with the child barely tilted his head before the other man stopped. No raised voice. No visible threat. Just obedience. "I do," he said. That was all. No explanation. No apology. My pulse kicked harder. "How?" His eyes held mine in a way that made lying feel pointless and honesty feel dangerous. "This is not the place," he said. I almost laughed, except nothing about the moment was funny. "It is the only place I am in right now." Ethan had one arm looped around his father's neck, but his eyes were on me. Not scared anymore. Just watchful. Like he was waiting to see whether I would disappear too. I glanced around the platform. The late train was still not there. The janitor was gone. A woman who had been drinking coffee near the stairs had vanished without my noticing. It was as if the whole station had quietly emptied around this reunion, leaving only fluorescent lights, rain-streaked windows, and me in the middle of something I did not understand. "I found him alone," I said. "He was crying. I was only trying to help." "I know exactly what you were doing, Ms. Hayes." The way he said it should have sounded formal. Instead it felt personal, and I did not know which was worse. He adjusted Ethan's weight on his hip. The boy's stuffed rabbit dangled from one small hand, brushing the black wool of his father's coat. "You should not be here when the next 5 minutes happen." A cold line worked its way down my back. What is that supposed to mean? His eyes flicked toward the main entrance, then back to me. "It means my son was not lost by accident." The station suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. I looked at Ethan, then at the men positioned near the stairs, the ticket machines, the glass doors that led out to the street. They were not searching anymore. They were guarding. "I do not understand," I whispered. "No," he said quietly. "But you are about to." Then, from somewhere above us, a metal door slammed open. Footsteps echoed across the upper concourse, and every man around him straightened at once while Ethan buried his face in his father's shoulder, and the man who knew my name looked at me like he had already made a decision I was not going to like. The sound of those footsteps changed everything. Not louder than the station announcements or the distant screech of a train somewhere below us, but sharper, more deliberate, like whoever was coming already knew exactly where to look. Every man around Ethan's father shifted at once. Not with panic, not with confusion, but with the smooth precision of people who had rehearsed too many bad nights to waste energy on surprise. I should have walked away then. I should have grabbed my bag, kept my head down, and taken the first exit that did not have a man in a black coat standing near it. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, because Ethan's small fingers were still twisted in the fabric of his father's coat, because the fear in that little body felt heartbreakingly real, and because the man holding him had just looked at me like leaving was no longer entirely my decision. "Come here," he said quietly. It took me a second to realize he was speaking to me, not his son. I stared at him. Absolutely not. The answer came out faster than I intended, thin with nerves, but steady enough to surprise even me. Something almost like approval flickered in his eyes, gone so fast I wondered if I imagined it. "Charlotte," he said, and somehow my name sounded lower this time, less like a command and more like an attempt at patience. "Please." That was worse. Commands I understood. Politeness from a man like him felt more dangerous because it suggested he could choose softness and still expect obedience. I tightened my grip on my bag strap. "You still have not told me how you know who I am." One of the men near the stairs touched his earpiece and muttered something I could not hear. Ethan's father listened without turning his head. "Later," he said. "Right now, you need to stand next to me." "Why?" His gaze held mine. Because someone else may already know you were sitting with my son. That landed somewhere deep and cold. I looked over his shoulder toward the upper concourse where the footsteps had come from, but all I could see were shadows sliding behind glass and steel. The station had the strange, hollow feeling of a stage after the audience leaves. Too much empty space. Too much echo. Who would want a child? I asked before I could stop myself. His face did not harden. It emptied. The same kind of people who think fear is useful. The answer was calm, but Ethan burrowed closer at the sound of his father's voice, as if he understood more than any child his age should. I felt something twist in my chest. This is insane, I whispered. I was waiting for a train. I know. I read a story to a little boy because he was alone. I know that too. And now you are telling me I am involved in something I do not even understand. He stepped closer, just enough that I caught the scent of rain and cedar and the faint trace of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. Up close, the control in him felt less like arrogance and more like necessity. Like if he loosened his grip for 1 second, something larger and darker would get in. I am telling you, he said, that you were kind to my son when he was frightened, and that makes you important tonight whether you wanted to be or not. Before I could answer, 2 more men appeared at the far end of the platform. Not as men. I knew that instantly from the way the air around us tightened. They were dressed like commuters, baseball caps low, jackets plain, but they moved wrong for tired passengers. Too focused. Too interested. One of the guards near me took half a step forward. Ethan's father shifted me behind the line of his shoulder with one smooth motion, Ethan still in his arms, as natural as breathing, as if protecting people was simply what his body did before his mind weighed the cost. I did not protest. My heart was already hammering too hard. Do not look at them again, he said under his breath. Why? Because if they remember your face, I will have to change your night. I swallowed. That is not a normal sentence. No, he said, eyes never leaving the far end of the platform. It is not. Then he turned slightly toward one of his men. Take the east exit. Bring the car around. Another guard nodded and disappeared. The 2 strangers had slowed now, scanning the platform, searching. One of them looked in our direction, then away, then back again. My skin went cold. They saw me with Ethan. I whispered. Maybe. At last he looked at me fully, and there was no room left for pretending this was a misunderstanding. Charlotte, I need you to trust me for the next 3 minutes. I almost laughed at that, because trust was a ridiculous thing to ask from a woman he had cornered in a train station after saying her name like a secret. But Ethan chose that moment to lift his head from his father's shoulder and look at me with red-rimmed eyes. Come with us, he whispered. Such a small voice. Such a simple plea. And somehow that was the thing that undid me. Not the guards, not the tension, not even the dangerous man standing too close. It was the child who had fallen asleep against my arm while I read to him under bad fluorescent lights. I exhaled shakily. 3 minutes, I said. Ethan's father gave one short nod, like we had just signed something invisible and binding. Then his hand came to the small of my back, not intimate, not rough, just firm enough to guide me as the station doors hissed open somewhere behind us, and the night outside waited with rain, black cars, and answers I was suddenly not sure I wanted. Rain hit us the second we stepped outside, cold and slanting, driven sideways by a wind that cut straight through my coat and turned the station steps slick beneath my boots. The city looked blurred at the edges, all headlights and wet pavement and steam rising from street grates, like Manhattan had been sketched in charcoal and left out in the storm. A black SUV idled at the curb with its lights low, and another sat half a block back, dark windows reflecting the station sign in broken gold. Everything about the scene felt too controlled, too arranged, as if the night had been waiting for one wrong move to reveal its real shape. Ethan's father kept one arm around his son and the other close enough to steer me without touching me unless he had to. His men spread out around us, not crowding, just placing themselves where they needed to be with the quiet confidence of people who had already calculated every angle. Get in, one of them said, opening the back door of the SUV. I stopped short on the curb. I said 3 minutes. I told Ethan's father. You did not say anything about a car. His gaze met mine through the rain. Up close, his face was even more striking under the streetlights, not because he was handsome, though he was, but because he looked like a man who had forgotten how to relax years ago and had never been allowed the luxury of getting it back. Water beaded on his lashes and the shoulders of his coat, but none of it softened him. 3 minutes became a different calculation, he said. I am not getting into a car with a stranger who knows my full name. His mouth moved very slightly, not quite a smile, more like a man acknowledging a point he had expected me to make. Damien Vale, he said. Now you know mine. The name landed with strange weight, not because I recognized it immediately, but because everyone around him seemed to shift at the sound of it, as if even introducing himself altered the air. Ethan lifted his head from Damien's shoulder and looked at me with heavy eyes. The long lashes, the pale skin, the deep green stare. He was exhausted. Brave, but exhausted. Please come, he whispered. I hated how quickly that tiny voice reached places in me my common sense could not defend. I have to go home, I said, though it sounded weak even to my own ears. Damien's eyes did not leave mine. Home is the first place anyone would look if they followed you from the platform. A knot formed under my ribs. You do not know where I live. Yes, he said calmly. I do. The rain seemed louder after that. For a second I could only stare at him, soaked to the skin, my bag clenched in one hand, my thoughts slipping all over themselves. That is not reassuring, I said. It was not meant to be. There was no arrogance in it. That made it worse. He said it like a fact, something cold and unavoidable, like weather. Behind us, tires hissed over wet pavement. I turned instinctively and saw a gray sedan slowing at the corner, then continuing past too slowly to be casual. One of Damien's men touched his earpiece and murmured something. Another opened an umbrella over Ethan, though the child barely seemed to notice. He was still watching me, waiting. If I get in that car, I said, lowering my voice, what exactly happens next? Damien took one step closer, enough that the storm no longer fully touched me, because his body blocked part of the wind. It should not have felt protective. It did. Next, he said, you stay warm, you get answers, and my son sleeps somewhere safe. My pulse stumbled. And after that, he said, you decide whether to hate me for the truth. A laugh almost escaped me, but there was nothing funny in the way he said it. No performance, no threat, just certainty sharpened by fatigue. The gray sedan rounded the block again. This time I noticed the way it slowed near the station entrance before moving on. One of the men by the SUV went still. Sir, he said quietly. Damien opened the back door himself. Warm light spilled out over the curb, soft beige leather, the faint scent of cedar and clean linen, a world too polished to belong to me. Ethan laid his cheek on Damien's shoulder, already half asleep. Charlotte, Damien said, and my name in his voice still felt unervingly familiar, as if he had practiced it in private. You can argue with me inside. I should have said no. Every survival instinct I had ever learned should have dragged me backward into the rain, into the station, into any direction that did not involve a black SUV and a man whose power arrived before he did. But the sedan was circling, Ethan was trembling with exhaustion, and Damien Vale was looking at me not like prey, not like a nuisance, but like someone whose presence had become inconveniently necessary. So I got in. The door shut with a deep, expensive sound that sealed out the city in an instant, and as the SUV pulled away from the curb, Damien slid in beside his sleeping son and said, without looking at me, you were never supposed to be at that station tonight. The city blurred past in streaks of white and gold beyond the rain-slicked glass, but inside the SUV everything was unervingly quiet. Not peaceful, controlled. The kind of silence that had been designed, paid for, and enforced by people who never raised their voices because they never had to. I sat rigid against cream leather that felt too soft for a woman wearing a damp thrift store coat, my bag clutched in my lap, like it could still somehow anchor me to the version of the night that had made sense. Across from me, Damien Vale sat with Ethan asleep against his chest, one large hand spread carefully between the boy's shoulder blades, moving in slow, absent circles that did not match the rest of him at all. That hand belonged to a father. The rest of him belonged to something colder. Streetlights flashed across his face in intervals, sharpening the angles, then softening them, then sharpening them again. Every few blocks, one of the black cars behind us shifted position in the side mirror, always there, always close. I tried to count turns, tried to track where we were going, but Manhattan at night had a way of folding in on itself when you were. Scared. You keep looking for landmarks, Damien said at last, still gazing down at his son. That implies I plan to enjoy this ride. His mouth tilted, just barely. You are doing remarkably well for someone who got into a stranger's car. You stopped being a stranger the second you told me where I live. That got his attention. His eyes lifted to mine, dark green and impossible to read in the low interior light. Fair. No, I said. Not fair. Unsettling. Ethan shifted in his sleep, his small hand fisting lightly in the front of Damien's coat, and Damien's entire posture changed around the movement, becoming stiller, gentler, like the child had placed his hand over the only pulse point he had left. I could not stop noticing things like that. It would have been easier if he were only one thing. Easier if he looked cruel when he spoke calmly, or careless when his son leaned into him like safety had a heartbeat. You said I would get answers, I said. So start with the obvious one. How do you know my name? For a moment, he said nothing. Rain whispered against the windows. The driver up front kept his eyes on the road, hands at 10 and 2, as if none of this conversation existed. Damien glanced toward the passing city, then back to me. You work 3 evenings a week at the West 84th Street Branch Library, he said. You run story hour every Saturday morning. You volunteer twice a month at St. Agnes Literacy Program. You always bring your own tea because you hate the coffee in the staff lounge. I stared at him. The inside of my chest went hollow. That is not an answer. That is surveillance. It is observation. From whom? He held my gaze. From me. I almost laughed, but the sound died before it reached my throat. That is supposed to make me feel better? No, he said. It is supposed to be honest. I looked down at my hands and realized my fingers had gone white around the strap of my bag. Why? The word came out smaller than I wanted. Damien exhaled slowly, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked tired in a human way, not just dangerous in an expensive coat. Because Ethan would not speak after his mother died, he said. Quietly, the words settled over the back seat like something fragile. Not much. Not to teachers, not to staff, not even to me some days. Then one Saturday, 6 months ago, he heard your voice from the children's room at the library. My breath caught. He glanced down at the sleeping boy, and his thumb brushed once over Ethan's hairline with a tenderness that felt private enough to make me look away. He sat through 40 minutes of fairy tales without fidgeting. Damien continued. The next week he asked to go back. The week after that, he called you the lady with the bedtime voice. I swallowed hard. Pieces of memory shifted into place. A little boy with solemn eyes and a nanny who kept to the back row. A child who never joined the others for songs, but always stayed until the last page. That was Ethan? I asked. Yes. You could have just said that at the station. No, he said. I could not. Something in his tone made me look up. There it was again, that impression of pressure contained too tightly, of truth arriving with conditions attached. Why not? He was quiet long enough that I thought he would refuse. Then he said, because if I had told you then that I knew exactly who you were, you would have run before I could get you somewhere safe. I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it because he was not wrong. Outside, the city thinned just enough for the streets to widen. We were heading uptown now, maybe farther. Safe from what? I asked. He studied me for one long second. From becoming useful to the wrong people. The answer slid over my skin like ice water. Useful how? You comforted my son in public. You were seen near him during a compromised window. That makes you either a witness, a connection, or leverage, depending on who is asking. My stomach tightened. You make it sound like people do not get to be ordinary around you. They do, Damien said softly. Until one bad night takes that from them. The SUV turned through iron gates that opened before we even slowed, and suddenly the city noise fell away. Trees. Stone. A long private drive glistening black under rows of low amber lights. Ahead, a mansion rose from the rain like something cut from shadow and money, all pale limestone, tall windows, and impossible stillness. My pulse kicked harder. Damien followed my stare. Before you panic, he said, voice maddeningly calm. You are not a prisoner here. I looked at the gates closing behind us, and then back at the man who knew my favorite tea, my library schedule, and the exact note my life had shifted on. That would be more comforting, I said, if your house did not have gates. For the first time, a real smile touched his mouth. Brief. Tired. Dangerous in a way warmth always is when it appears where it should not. Charlotte, he said, as the car rolled to a stop beneath the grand stone portico, you are going to learn very quickly that almost everything about me is more complicated than it should be. The front doors opened before I reached them, as if the house had been watching for our arrival. Warm air spilled out first, carrying the scent of cedarwood, polished stone, and something faintly sweet from a fire burning somewhere deeper inside. I followed Damien through the entryway with my damp coat clinging to my sleeves and my boots too loud against the marble floor, painfully aware that I looked like exactly what I was, a tired library assistant from a third-floor walk-up who had taken one wrong turn into a world built behind gates. The foyer rose 2 stories high beneath a chandelier that looked old enough to have watched generations of rich people make terrible decisions. A curved staircase swept upward at the far end, and everywhere I looked there was restraint instead of excess. Expensive, yes. Impossibly so. But not flashy. The kind of wealth that did not need to prove itself. A woman in her 50s appeared from a hallway to the right, silver at her temples, posture straight, expression composed in the way only people who have seen everything can manage. "Mr. Vale," she said softly. Then her eyes moved to Ethan and gentled at once. "He fell asleep?" Damien nodded. "In the car." The woman stepped closer, but Ethan tightened his arms around Damien's neck without waking. Damien adjusted his hold instinctively. "It is all right," she said. "I will have something warm prepared." Then she looked at me, not rudely, not curiously, just carefully, as if filing me away under a category she had not decided on yet. "Miss Hayes," Damien said, turning slightly toward me. "This is Mrs. Alvarez. She runs this house better than anyone in it deserves." One of Mrs. Alvarez's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. "Some of us try," she said. I blinked. It was the first thing approaching humor I had heard since stepping into Damien Vale's orbit, and the fact that it came from the elegant woman in dark gray silk somehow steadied me more than anything else had. "You are soaked through," she said to me. "Come with me. We will fix that." I instinctively looked at Damien. I hated that I did. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "You are safe here," he said, and this time the words landed differently, not because I believed them completely, but because he said them while holding a sleeping child against his chest like the rest of the night had cost him more than he wanted anyone to know. Mrs. Alvarez led me down a long hallway lined with framed black and white photographs, landscapes mostly, winter trees, old city streets, a shoreline in fog. No family portraits. No smiling faces in silver frames. That absence told me more about the house than decoration ever could. "You do not need to be afraid of him all the time," Mrs. Alvarez said as we walked. I let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "That feels optimistic." Her mouth curved at one corner. I said all the time. She guided me into a beautiful guest room in muted cream and blue, with a bed large enough to make my apartment look fictional and a fireplace flickering behind a glass screen. Folded clothes already waited on the end of the bed, soft black leggings, a cashmere sweater in ivory, socks thick enough to survive winter. I stared at them. How did these get here so fast? Mrs. Alvarez gave me a look that suggested this house moved faster than my questions ever would. I guessed her size. She crossed to a side table and set down a mug that had not been there a moment before. Steam curled from the top. Chamomile. With honey. No milk. I looked at her sharply. "How did you know that?" For the first time, something like sympathy touched her face. "Mr. Vale notices things." My throat went dry. She moved to the door, then paused. "You may lock it if you wish. No one here will object." That, more than the warm clothes or the tea, loosened something tight in my chest. When she left, I stood alone in the quiet room and listened to the rain tapping softly against tall windows. My hands shook as I peeled off my wet coat. I should have called someone. I should have gone home hours ago. I should have been anywhere else. But there I was, in borrowed cashmere, standing in a mansion owned by a man who had watched me read fairy tales at the library and remembered how I took my tea. 10 minutes later, dressed and warmer, I stepped back into the hallway with the mug still in my hands. I had barely closed the door behind me when I heard a child's sleepy voice at the far end of the corridor. "Charlotte." I turned and saw Ethan standing barefoot outside an open bedroom door, rabbit tucked under one arm, his dark hair messy from sleep. his green eyes searching for me in the soft pool of lamplight. And behind him, one hand braced against the doorframe, tie loosened now, coat gone, the top button of his shirt undone, Damien looked at me with an expression so unreadable it made my pulse stumble. "I told you," he said quietly, "he would ask for you." Ethan stood there like he had been pulled out of a dream too soon, small and pale in navy cotton pajamas, one hand clutching that battered rabbit, the other rubbing sleep from his eyes, as if he still was not sure I was real. Something in my chest softened before I could stop it. "Hey," I said quietly, setting the untouched mug on a console table near the wall. "You should be in bed." He did not answer right away. He just padded toward me over the polished wood floor and stopped close enough that I could see the crease from his pillow on one cheek. Then he looked up with that solemn, searching expression children get when they are deciding whether hope is safe. "You left the station," he said, voice rough with sleep. "I did," I told him. "But I did not leave you." It was the truth, though I had not known until that second how much I meant it. Ethan seemed to consider that. Then, with the quiet certainty only children can manage, he reached for my hand. My fingers curled around his automatically. Behind him, Damien stayed in the doorway, watching us with a stillness that felt heavier than silence. Without the overcoat, he looked less untouchable and somehow more dangerous because the human details were clearer now. The rolled sleeves, the loosened tie, the fatigue at the edges of his eyes. He looked like a man who had carried too much for too long and had forgotten there was any other way to stand. "He woke up 10 minutes after I put him down," Damien said. His voice was low enough not to startle the child. "He asked for the story lady." I should have smiled. I almost did. Instead I said, "That is not actually my legal title." To my surprise, Ethan's mouth twitched. Damien's did too, though his expression settled back into control almost immediately, like warmth was something he allowed in carefully measured amounts. Ethan tugged on my hand. "Can you finish the bunny one?" he asked. "The bunny one," I repeated. Then I realized he meant the book from the station, the old paperback still damp from the rain and probably forgotten in the back seat of a black SUV. "I do not have it with me." "I do," Damien said. At my look, he stepped into the hallway holding the bent little book in one hand. Of course he had it. Of course a man who noticed tea preferences and library schedules would notice the storybook too. He crossed to Ethan and handed it to him. But when the child reached for me again, Damien's gaze lifted to mine. "Would you read to him?" The question should not have startled me, but it did. Maybe because he asked it softly. Maybe because for all his power, there was something unguarded beneath the words, something dangerously close to need. "You are his father," I said before I could stop myself. Damien did not flinch. "Yes." "Then maybe he wants you." Ethan shook his head instantly, still holding my hand. "I want both." The hallway went quiet. Children had a brutal talent for asking for exactly the thing adults did not know how to give. For one suspended second, I watched something flicker across Damien's face. Not irritation, not surprise. Grief, maybe. Quick and carefully hidden, but there. The kind that does not leave when a funeral ends, only learns better manners. "All right," I said gently, because Ethan was watching both of us now with too much hope for me to stand there making this harder. "But only if we keep it short. It is way past your bedtime." Ethan nodded with the solemn gratitude of someone being granted something enormous. He led me into the bedroom, still holding my hand, and I stepped into a room that looked nothing like the rest of the house. The furniture was elegant, yes, but lived in. A shelf of picture books lined one wall. Wooden trains sat abandoned on a rug the color of storm clouds. A nightlight shaped like a moon glowed near the bed, casting everything in soft silver. There were signs of care everywhere, but also signs of absence. Too much order. Too much quiet. The kind of room maintained by loving adults and used by a child who had learned early how not to make trouble. Ethan climbed into the big bed and scooted to one side. Then he looked expectantly between me and Damien. I hesitated. Damien noticed. Of course he noticed. "You can sit in the chair," he said, gesturing to a wingback near the bed. "No one is asking you to trust me more than tonight already requires." It was such an absurdly perceptive thing to say that I stared at him for a second too long. Then I took the chair. Damien sat on the edge of the bed, close enough for Ethan to lean against his arm. I opened the book, smoothed a page that had wrinkled from rain, and began to read. My voice sounded different in that room. Softer. Smaller somehow. as if the walls were listening. Ethan relaxed minute by minute, the tension slipping out of his tiny shoulders as the story unfolded in slow, familiar rhythms. Halfway through, I looked up by accident and found Damien watching me instead of the book. Not carelessly, not boldly, intently, like he was trying to understand how something as ordinary as a voice could calm the most precious thing in his world. I dropped my gaze back to the page too quickly, pulse suddenly unsteady for reasons I did not care to examine. When I finished, Ethan's breathing had gone deep and even. His rabbit was trapped between us like a silent witness. I began to stand, but Ethan's hand found mine without waking and held on. "He does that," Damien murmured. I looked at the small fingers wrapped around my own. Apparently, Damien reached over carefully, trying to loosen Ethan's grip, but the child only held tighter. His father let out a breath that almost sounded like defeat. "You should probably stay until he falls into a deeper sleep." I should have refused. I should have remembered the gates, the guards, the dangerous calm in this house. Instead, I sat back down while rain tapped gently against the windows and the moon-shaped night light painted silver across Ethan's blankets. Then, in a voice so low it barely seemed meant to be heard, Damien said, "You have no idea what it did to me to hear him ask for you." His words settled into the room like a confession he had not meant to make. I kept my eyes on Ethan because looking at Damien felt suddenly dangerous in a way I did not have a name for. The child's fingers were still wrapped around mine, warm and trusting, his breathing slow beneath the silver glow of the moon-shaped nightlight. Outside the windows, rain traced faint lines down the glass, and somewhere deeper in the house a clock chimed once, low and elegant, reminding me how late it had become. "He asks for very little," Damien said after a moment. His voice was quiet enough that it seemed built for shadows and sleeping children. "So when he does, I pay attention." I swallowed and finally looked up. He was still seated on the edge of the bed, one arm resting near Ethan's pillow, his broad shoulders bent slightly forward, as if this room lowered something in him the rest of the world kept sharpened. "That sounds less like fatherhood," I said softly, "and more like strategy." One corner of his mouth moved. "For me, they are often the same thing." I should have hated that answer. Instead, I understood it more than I wanted to. Some people were raised in homes where love arrived easily, in loud kitchens and open arms and ordinary mistakes. Other people learned early that caring for someone meant watching doors, noticing patterns, preparing for loss before it happened. I had the strange feeling Damien Vale had never had the luxury of loving casually. Ethan made a sleepy sound and shifted, his head rolling slightly toward his father. Damien's hand moved instantly, smoothing the blanket near the child's shoulder with a gentleness that still startled me every time I saw it. "You keep looking surprised," he murmured. "At what?" I asked. His eyes lifted to mine in the dim light. "That I know how to be tender." Heat rose unexpectedly under my skin. "I did not say that. You did not need to." The quiet confidence in him should have irritated me. Sometimes it did. But not then. Not in that room with a sleeping child between us and rain pressing softly against the night. "You still have not told me everything," I said. "About the station. About why those men were there. About why you said my name like that." Damien leaned back slightly, studying me with that same unnerving focus that made me feel as if he was reading lines I had not realized were visible. "I said your name like that," he replied, "because hearing it in my own house was never supposed to happen." The answer tightened something in my chest. "That is not really an explanation." "No," he said. "It is the edge of one." For a second, neither of us spoke. Ethan's grip on my hand loosened just enough for me to think I might be free, then tightened again in his sleep, and Damien let out the faintest breath of what might have been amusement. "You are trapped by a 6-year-old, he said. "There are worse captors." His gaze dropped briefly to our joined hands, and something in his expression changed. Softer, more complicated. It passed so quickly I could have imagined it, if not for the fact that my pulse answered before my mind could. I looked back at Ethan and forced myself to breathe evenly. What happened to his mother? I asked before I could decide whether it was too personal. Damien went still. Not dramatically, just completely, like every instinct in him had closed a door at once. I regretted the question immediately. "You do not have to answer that," I said. His eyes stayed on his son. "Her name was Vivian," he said at last, and even that simple sentence carried the hush of an old wound. "She loved old books," hated cold weather, and always fell asleep during black and white movies no matter how much she claimed to adore them. I listened without moving. Ethan has her patience, Damien continued quietly, and her eyes when he is disappointed in me. A faint smile touched his mouth, but it did not stay. He was 4 when she died. Since then, the world has been louder for him. Harder. Something in his voice made my own chest ache. I knew that kind of before and after. The kind that split a life into 2 clean, cruel halves. I thought of my mother's hospital room, the quiet beep of machines, the way ordinary objects turned sacred after someone was gone because they had once touched them. I am sorry, I said, and I meant it. Damien looked at me then, really looked, as if he was measuring whether I understood grief as language or merely as etiquette. Whatever he saw seemed to settle something in him. Thank you. We sat there in the hush that follows truth, not comfortable exactly, but honest in a way the rest of the night had not allowed. At some point, Ethan's fingers finally relaxed enough for me to slide my hand free. I did it slowly, careful not to wake him, and stood from the chair with more reluctance than made any sense. Damien rose too. Up close, in the soft light, he seemed taller than ever, not because of his height, but because every room had learned to shape itself around him. You should sleep, I whispered. So should you. I glanced toward the door. Will I be allowed to leave in the morning? A shadow crossed his face, brief but unmistakable. Allowed is not the word I would choose. My spine stiffened. That sounds alarmingly close to a no. He stepped nearer, not enough to crowd me, just enough that his voice no longer belonged to the room, but only to the space between us. Charlotte, he said, and my name in that low voice still carried too much recognition, too much memory I did not yet understand. By morning, you will know something you do not know tonight. I held his gaze, which is, for one long second, all I heard was rain and Ethan's steady breathing and my own heart making poor decisions. Then Damien said that the reason I knew your name had nothing to do with the library at all. The room seemed to lose air after he said that. I stood there beside Ethan's bed with the moon-shaped nightlight painting silver along the blankets and Damien Vale looking at me like he had just moved the world 1 inch off its axis and was waiting to see whether I noticed. What does that mean? I asked, keeping my voice barely above a whisper so I would not wake the child between us. Damien's gaze flicked once to Ethan, then back to me. Not tonight. The answer landed like a door closing. I folded my arms across the borrowed sweater, more to hold myself together than for warmth. You do not get to do that. Do what? Drop a sentence like that, and then decide I am too fragile for the rest. His expression changed, not softer exactly, but more attentive, as if anger from me interested him in a way fear had not. This has nothing to do with fragility, he said. It has everything to do with timing. I almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. That is a very polished excuse. It is also true. The calm in his voice should have infuriated me more than it did. Instead, it made me feel off balance, because beneath all that control there was strain now, unmistakable and tightly leashed, like he was not hiding the truth to manipulate me, but to stop something larger from breaking open in a room where his son was sleeping. I glanced at Ethan. His lashes rested against his cheeks, dark and still, one arm thrown over the stuffed rabbit, the kind of peaceful children only look when they trust the walls around them. I lowered my voice even further. You brought me here because I was seen with him. Fine. I understand that part. But if you knew my name before tonight, and not because of the library, then you owe me more than half sentences. Damien stood very still. You are right. The words surprised me enough that I blinked. He noticed. Of course he noticed. I owe you a great many things, he said quietly. Answers among them. Then start with one. He looked past me for a second, toward the rain-dark windows, the sleeping child, the hush of a house that seemed built to contain secrets without ever fully burying them. When he looked at me again, something in his face had shifted. Not the hard edges. Those were still there. But there was less distance now, as if he had decided keeping me outside the truth was no longer possible. Your mother's name was Evelyn Hayes, he said. I forgot to breathe. The room did not spin. That would have been easier. Instead, everything sharpened at once, every sound suddenly too clear. The rain. Ethan's breathing. The faint crackle from the fireplace in the hall. How do you know my mother's name? I asked. My voice did not sound like mine anymore. Damien's eyes held mine with unnerving steadiness. Because 20 years ago, Before I was old enough to understand what I was hearing, I heard my father say it in this house. Cold moved through me in a slow, exact line. No, it came out immediately, instinctively, because rejection was easier than comprehension. Damien did not argue. She came here once. That is impossible. It is not. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mother was a schoolteacher from Queens. She did not come to houses like this. No, he said softly. She came because she was looking for someone. I stared at him. Pieces of memory I had not touched in years began to rise without permission. My mother keeping an old photograph in the back of a dresser drawer. Her once saying there were parts of New York where money made its own laws. The way she used to stop talking when I asked too much about the years before my father. Who was she looking for? I whispered. Damien's jaw tightened once. My older brother. I actually stepped back, the movement small enough not to make noise, but real. What? Ethan stirred slightly, and we both went still until his breathing settled again. Damien lowered his voice even more. He died before I turned 16. But before that, there were rumors. Quiet ones. My father shut them down whenever they surfaced. He paused, and for the first time since I met him, I saw uncertainty cross his face, not in whether he believed what he was saying, but in what it might do to me once I heard it. The rumor was that my brother had fallen in love with a woman he was never supposed to know. A woman named Evelyn Hayes. My mouth went dry. You are telling me my mother knew your family. I am telling you, Damien said, each word careful and low, that when I looked at your face the first Saturday I saw you reading to children, I knew I had seen your eyes before. Not in person. In a photograph my father should have destroyed and never did. My knees felt weak in a way I hated. I reached for the back of the chair to steady myself. Damien took one step toward me, then stopped, as if some instinct told him touching me now would make everything worse. Charlotte, he said, and my name no longer sounded like a secret or a command. It sounded like something heavier. Older. I do not know yet what your mother was to my brother. I do not know why she came here or why she never came back. But I know this. The moment I saw you, I knew the past had not stayed buried. I could only stare at him. My whole life had been ordinary in the careful, exhausted way most lives are ordinary. Rent, subway delays, library budgets, grief that fit inside memory and did not ask too many new questions. And now a man standing in his son's doorway was telling me my mother had once crossed into this house, into this family, into this dangerous, impossible world, and somehow left echoes strong enough for him to recognize me on sight. I swallowed hard. Why did you never tell me? Damien's eyes darkened with something that looked painfully close to regret. Because the first time I saw you, I thought I could keep you far away from all of this. Rain slid down the tall windows behind him. Ethan slept on, one small hand curled near his cheek. And in the quiet glow of a child's bedroom, with the city hidden beyond gates and weather and secrets, I understood something I had not been ready to understand at the station, or in the car, or even 5 minutes earlier. I had not stepped into Damien Vale's world by accident. Somehow, impossibly, I had been standing at the edge of it my whole life.